So I want to start on page 19 because I said something last time. From some comments I got afterwards, I'm not sure that it was understood. It's not too easy to understand. So this is verse 22. We have a board here. I should write it on the board. After they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu describes what has happened and then expels them from the garden. Now, let's try to do what's written on the page, and then maybe I'll talk about variations afterwards. Hashem God said, "Behold, man has become like the unique one among us." In the Hebrew, Hein ha'adam haya ka'achad mimenu. Now, if you speak any Hebrew, achad is a funny way to talk. If it meant like one of us, which many translations do, right, it should have been echad. Ke'echad mimenu, like one of us. What's achad? Why achad instead of echad? Now, the implication of achad is the chosen one, designated one, unique one, superior one, leader, priest, someone who's singled out as different from everybody else. When Isaac takes up residence in a certain place and the king is looking out of his window and observes their behavior, and he calls Isaac in and he says, "You should have told me you're man and wife. Kimat shechav achad ha'am es ishtecha." Almost achad ha'am, achad of the people, took your wife. He meant himself. He meant the king. And he said echad, he said achad. Achad, there Rashi says, means the designated single one among. He wasn't going to say, "I was going to take your wife," but he said it in a direct, indirect, implicated way that the designated one among the people, meaning the king, almost took her to wife. So Rashi here, the translation here follows Rashi, explains it the same way. The unique one among us, man has become like the unique one among us. And then it says, knowing good and bad. That would be natural to explain as follows. Well, Rashi became like that unique one. How did he become like that unique one? By knowing good and bad, because that unique one for sure knows good and bad, and Rashi and the man now also shares this august position of knowing good and bad, and that's what they have in common, right? That would be a natural way to read the verse. Rashi rejects that. He rejects that. Look at the translation that I gave you, 322. Became like one of us, or the being who is one, unique among us, which is the way we just read it, means, lo, behold, he is unique among the terrestrial ones, even as I am unique among the celestial ones, period. He's unique below, just like I am unique above. You know what we share? Uniqueness. Now, if you would stop there and ask, well, in what way is God unique among the heavenly beings? Well, for one thing, he's the creator of the universe. That's pretty unique. There's nothing like him up there. He's the only creator of the universe that there is. Another thing, he's infinite. Everything else is finite. That's pretty unique. Another thing, he's unlimited in power. That's pretty unique. God has lots of uniquenesses. The question of how God is unique among the ones above is a no-brainer. There are lots of ways that make him absolutely different from all the creatures above. And what man below and God above share is that God above is unique in 1,600 different ways, which are all obvious, and man below is unique, different from all the things below. The only question that might remain in your mind is, well, how is man unique below? How God is unique above, we understand, but how is man unique below? And that's what Rashi comes to explain. And in what does his uniqueness consist? In what does man's uniqueness consist below? In knowing good and evil. The way Rashi explains it There's absolutely no reason whatsoever to say that God knows good and evil. That's not the subject. And it isn't in the knowledge of good and evil that they share and make one like the other. It isn't like that. It's uniqueness. God is unique above in the various ways that he's unique, and man is unique below in the way that he's unique. Oh, you don't know that. It's not obvious in the text. Right, so the text says, knowing good and evil. That's how man is unique below. And what unites them is that each one is unique. But nowhere does the verse say or imply that God knows good and evil. Indeed. Why would you assume that the other creatures above don't know good and evil? The angels know the difference between good and evil. So God's knowing good and evil isn't the subject here. And I stress this because Maimonides would deny vociferously that God knows the difference between good and evil. Because for Maimonides, knowing good and evil is a degradation. It's a distortion. It's an illusion. It's a hallucination. It's a terrible mistake. It's false. You certainly don't associate that with God. And so, I only realized that preparing to teach this last time, but that's what Rashi is really saying here. Rashi, I don't mean to say that Rashi shares the Rambam's point of view, but it's very striking to me that Rashi reads the verse in such a way that the verse does not say that God knows good and evil. Yeah.
It seems a bit odd to me because the uniqueness of man here is, it's not unique that man is unique. You know, there are lots of, each animal has a trait that is unique. But why is it that God is unique in every way? Man is just unique in this one way, and so what is...
I think that's a good remark, especially philosophically it's a good remark. Everything is different from everything else, otherwise it would be something else. There wouldn't be any difference at all.
Yeah.
So when you say that something's unique, you have to be saying something that fits into the natural categories that you think are important. You know, and if I say, this cup is unique, and you say, really? I say, yeah, because this one's over here, that one's over there. They aren't in the same place, so obviously it's in a different place, so it's obviously unique. You would take that as a joke, right? You know, why did you say it then? If that's all you had to say, you know, it's obvious and it's unimportant and uninteresting, right? This is a point that I was taught when I was a graduate student in philosophy. Any two things share an infinity of characteristics and are divided by an infinity of characteristics. So if you want to say they're similar or different, that means you promote certain characteristics over other characteristics to talk about. And that gives a picture of what you think is important, what you don't think is important. It's a quite deep remark. So, and he's the pasuk says more than that. It says man has become unique. Become unique. So what happened? He ate from the tree. Right? So he became unique in this respect, that he alone knows the difference between good and evil. Right? And now an onlooker coming on the scene now will see this as a superiority over all the animals, which it is, even though it's distorted and leads to false conclusions and false understanding, but the animals have no understanding. You know what they say? You couldn't make a mistake in Chinese, could you? You couldn't make a mistake in Chinese. You don't know enough Chinese to make a mistake in Chinese. You have to have already, you know, that was a bad move in chess. The guy doesn't know the rules. It's not a bad move. It's not a move at all. It's just moving pieces of wood around. So the fact that we have a distorted view of what's really important, what's obligatory, what's required, and what's good and evil is still infinitely removed from the animals. It's just that it isn't really accurate, doesn't really connect in the right way with the reality. But it's better than nothing. So I think that's implied by the verse because it speaks about what he became, not just saying he is, right? And that eases that. But that's what's going on here. Now, what I said in the name of Maimonides was something else. He has something much more radical to say here. He says the translation is a mistake. In particular, the comma is a mistake. And really, if you're looking at the English, the word, the comma comes after us. Move the comma back 2 words. And now it reads, Behold, man has become like the unique one, comma. And he retranslates it a little bit like this. Behold, man has become unique. He is now unique, different from everything else. And the way in which he's unique is, now instead of among us, read the words, from himself, by himself, in and of himself, alone, independently, knowing good and evil. Because the word mimenu in Hebrew is ambiguous. It can mean from us or from him. So Maimonides makes those two changes, and he derives from here this astonishingly important principle that man knows the basic principles of good and evil from his own nature. He knows it from his own mind, from his own thinking, from his own understanding. He knows the basic principles of good and evil. And that's unique among the whole of the creation.
Is that intuitively as well he knows it, or as an observation?
Okay, you're asking a very important question. He says it's it intuitively, there's no way observation. Maimonides elsewhere describes this kind of knowledge in the following way. I remember when the philosophical world and the psychological went through a revolution in the middle of the 20th century. Up until that time, it was thought that there are two types of knowledge that people and animals have. One is instinctive, with which they are born, and that which they learn. It turns out that there's a third type of knowledge, which is neither instinctive nor learned, but rather, through the experiences that you have, it's triggered. The development is triggered by the experience. If you don't have the experiences, the development, it won't be triggered, but on the other hand, it's not learned. So, one example that we were taught is that if you have an egg, which has the beginnings of a bird in it, and you hatch it in the laboratory, and then let it free to the wild, that bird will not build a nest. It requires being hatched in the nest and growing up in the nest to be able to build the nest next year. But then, if it's hatched in the already built nest, it never sees a nest built. So how come next year it can build a nest? The answer is, being hatched and growing up in the nest triggers a certain brain development, which includes the circuits for building nests. Not that you learn it from seeing nests built, but it's triggered that way. Another example that's given is this. This is very cruel. This experiment was actually done. Newborn kittens are blind. It takes time for the sight to develop. So here's what they did. They created a circular environment with random colors on the walls and sawdust on the floor. And they took a pair of newborn kittens and they put them in this environment, one on the floor, and in the center of the roof there's a pivot on which there's a long bar which can rotate. Hanging down from one end of the bar is a piece of rope that goes down to a harness which the kitten on the floor is wearing. And hanging down from the other end of the rope is a shorter, other end of the bar, is a shorter rope to which is attached a basket into which the other newborn kitten is placed with 4 holes for its 4 limbs. And it is attached to the basket. Okay, now here's the setup. Because the one on the ground is on the ground, it can walk around. When it walks, it moves the bar, so that the one in the basket is moved also. The result of this is that the 2 kittens get exactly the same amount of motion. And then they are in exactly the same environment. And the result is that the one on the ground in the harness, walking on the ground, develops sight, and the one in the basket remains blind. Now, why is that? Because the one on the ground, as it's walking, there's a coordination between what it feels and what it sees. If it goes closer to the environment, the things get bigger. If it goes further from the environment, it goes around. The things move systematically with the motions of its paws. And it learns to associate, or rather the association is built into the brain that the sight develops. Whereas learning is not the right word, the sight develops. Whereas the one in the basket has exactly the same motions, but its muscles aren't involved. Its sensory apparatus isn't involved, its tactile sense isn't involved, and therefore it remains blind. So what this means is that walking on the ground with your eyes open triggers the development in the brain of sight. Whereas having exactly the same motions without the tactile senses coming in, sight never develops. It's also something which is not instinctual and not learned by trial and error, learned by reinforcement. It's just an association which the brain picks up. Now, I learned this because I lived through the Chomsky revolution in linguistics, and one of Chomsky's famous claims, which is still alive, there are those who disbelieve it, but I think they're right, I think he's wrong. I think he's right and they're wrong. And that is that if you study children when they develop the ability to speak a language, speak and understand a language, you'll find that there isn't enough stimulus in their environment for them to learn how the language works. It's underdetermined by the amount of stimulus that they have, which means that given the stimulus that they have, it's impossible to learn the language. What you have to understand is that the brain is pre-programmed to respond to a minimum of stimuli and develop the whole structure of language. The basic structure of language is pre-programmed in the brain, and the stimuli that it undergoes triggers those pieces of the brain to develop in certain ways. But in standard learning theory, you'd never be able to learn it. One of his proofs is that you have people who immigrate to another country, and the children are brought up in that home, and the parents don't speak the language fluently. They speak it only in a very minimalized way, and the children, through exposure to their parents, come out fluent speakers of the language. Because the parents give them, let's say, 20%, which are like points on a graph, and the children naturally fill in all the empty spaces. They fill it in because the brain is pre-programmed to develop under this kind of stimulation. Now, I think that's the right. Maimonides talks about this. He says, when the baby's born, it doesn't have, let's say, character, doesn't have character traits, but it's predisposed to develop character traits under certain types of experiences. And different babies will be predisposed in different ways. So you can have two babies undergoing the same experiences and they'll develop in different ways. But without the predisposition, they wouldn't develop any traits at all. So that's where these moral rules come from. And by the way, the Gemara actually talks about this in a certain indirect way. Now we're going back 1,600 years. The Gemara says, if the Torah had not been given, people would have learned modesty from the cat. You don't see cats engaging in elimination or in copulation. And would have learned industry from the ant. The ants work all the time. You see them running around all the time. You don't see them taking coffee breaks and siestas, and watching football games. They're always working. We would have learned these traits from observing the world. And the obvious question is, we would have learned industry from the ant. Why wouldn't we have learned sloth from the sloth? The sloth sleeps 16 hours a day. That's the time it eats, from the trees in Australia. I spend all the time sleeping. Or why wouldn't we have learned a lack of tznius, a lack of privacy, from the animals that don't practice privacy? So the Gemara is obviously assuming that as we walk through the world and as we see various phenomena, certain phenomena will impress us. We'll look at that and say, hey, look at that. That's really important. That's impressive. There's a certain nobility about that. And other things will repel us. That's built in. That's built in. We didn't learn that. We respond to the world that way. Then we have to decide what to do with it. We can decide whether to imitate it or not. But that it will catch our attention and we'll see the value of it is something that's programmed into us from the beginning. So this now creates a third category of behavior, things that are neither instinctive nor learned, but are triggered by experience. And I think this is what's meant by understanding moral rules. If you have normal experience, you will develop normally an understanding of the rules of correct behavior, right and wrong, good and evil. It could happen that a person would be brought up under abnormal experience and wouldn't develop it. We have on record children whose parents cruelly denied them any interaction and who didn't get linguistic input, and when they're rescued at the age of 10, and then they are surrounded by language, they never learn to speak well. They never learn to speak fluently because there's a window of opportunity for the brain to develop these characteristics, and that window was passed, and then they'll never pick it up. And they speak their first language like a second language. They learn something they learned to think about and have to calculate through. It doesn't become natural. It doesn't become instinctive. So that's what Chomsky said about language, and I think it's true about this idea of developing moral rules as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. You have a question? Yeah.
Is that category the way that our forefathers knew how to keep the Torah before it was given?
I'll tell you, it's a very interesting question. Does that category fit the way our forefathers knew how to keep the Torah before it was given? First of all, the examples I'm giving you are the norm for the whole population. So this would be what, 1/1,000,000,000 of 1% of the population, because they were the only people in the whole world that figured this out. There is some discussion of how they knew. The one position that I know well, which I think can be easily accounted for, is this. It says that his 2 kidneys became like 2 rabbis teaching him Torah. No, that doesn't sound like research. It doesn't sound like it sounds being taught. And the Ramban explains it as Ruach HaKodesh, which means divine inspiration. So that's not at all what we're talking about. We're talking now about a direct divine input. It's not sort of meditating on leather. Leather, I wonder. Yeah, well, if you take the leather, you could write on it, you know. What should you write on? A piece of steel? No. A piece of wood? No. I know, feathers. You could use no, that's not the kind of mental process that he went through. What he saw on his own, we don't know, but we do know, according to this idea, that he was taught, because Baruch Hu taught him. He had to distinguish himself to be worthy of being taught, but not by getting this material, by understanding that there has to be a creator behind the world, they're willing to die for it, so on and so on. That's where it would come from. Yeah.
I have an opinion that giving sacrifice, korbanot, is also instinctual for man.
Giving sacrifice is what?
Giving a sacrifice, like it's instinctual. It's something that is automatic. That is I've never thought that in my life that I've done something wrong and I should give a korban. I think maybe the Rambam said it.
No, I don't think I've read every word that he's written, but I've read a lot of them. I doubt that would be very much. And what you would have to say is that it's instinctual in people to know there's someone to give a sacrifice to.
Is that?
Well, I'm just saying that would have to be included in the statement, right?
Yes.
And I think that would be very extreme. Be very extreme. From our point of view, the first people were prophets. God spoke to them. So there was a record in history that there is a higher power, and the higher power is responsible for the world, and so forth and so on. Right?
That leap wouldn't have to be made, that I'm not just making the korban, I'm giving the korban to someone.
Otherwise it's not a korban. Right? Otherwise just burning an animal, you're having barbecue for supper.
Dinner, yeah.
That's right. Okay? All right, I felt that we didn't get this really clear. Now, let's take a look. We have now the story of Cain and Abel, which is endlessly fascinating. But as I told you, I'm only going to do what I have here in the Rashi. So let's start the story, and I'll show you something which is really, I think, very important. This is chapter 4. The man knew or had known his wife Eve. She conceived, bore Cain, saying, I have acquired a man with Hashem, whatever that means. Additionally, she bore his brother Abel. Abel became a shepherd, and Cain became a tiller of the ground. By the way, I should tell you that in the English, where you have spaces, it's absolutely meaningless. The only real spaces in the Hebrew text are on the right-hand side, in the Hebrew. And there they have reproduced the spaces in the Torah scroll. So don't read any punctuation into the fact that it's a new paragraph, and it's absolutely nothing. It means nothing. After a period of time, Cain brought an offering to Hashem of the fruit of the ground. And I'll just change the translation a little bit. Also, Abel, he brought from the firstlings of his flock and from the choicest. Hashem turned to Abel and to his offering. Cain and his offering did not turn. Let's stop there. Okay, they both bring offerings. God accepts one and not the other. Right? Now Rashi, I have here under 4:3, says, of the fruit of the ground, Cain's offering, of the worst fruits. There's an Agada which says that it was linseed, which I don't know what it is, but okay. And the question is, where is Rashi coming from? Where is Rashi coming from? Why would Rashi say it's from the worst fruits? What logic is there in the context which could justify Rashi's statement that it's of the first fruits? I told you at the beginning that Rashi's doing only that which you can get out of reading it, taking it seriously, paying attention to the words, but the words mean the words, the context, the implications, and so forth and so on. He's not relying on rabbinic sources. Even if he quotes rabbinic sources, he's not relying on them. And the proof is because there are lots of rabbinic sources he doesn't quote. And he will even offer an explanation which isn't in the rabbinic sources on the very same verse. He will not do that. And sometimes he'll take a rabbinic comment on one verse and move it to a different verse. So he's clearly not just reporting the rabbinic tradition and using that as his authority. He's got to have some logic behind what he's saying. Yeah, what do you say?
I'd say it's one or two options. Could either be the word hadama, meaning like earthly, bottom, or it could just mean pre-hadama,
Yeah.
of the ground. Or it would be from the second statement, Vehevel avi gamhu mibechorot zona vechavehem veyasha. So it's saying it's like the best of the flock, and they don't say that by Hevel, or they don't say that by Cain, and therefore it would mean that there's some sort of difference there.
Okay, so we have two suggestions so far. It says the earth, soil, dirt, that may carry a negative implication. Also, if you read what's written as a contrast between Cain and Hevel, now the contrast here is because of what's not said.
Yeah.
So it's only an implied contrast. By Hevel, it says he brought from the best, and from Cain, it doesn't say he brought from the best. So perhaps you could infer from that Cain's was not the best. Okay, another thought, yeah?
I mean, I don't fully can interpret yet, but in the previous portion, it's written first the name of Abel. I mean, I don't know why, but first we see Cain is written first when he was born.
Who was written first?
Cain was
Cain.
first when he was born.
Yes.
And then the second, after we see Abel was born too, given birth.
Right.
And then in the next one, in Gimel, you see first when he became a shepherd and Cain became a worker of the land. There is it's Abel is first. Like why suddenly we change the order of appearance of?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. Why it was changed? Now go to verse 3 and ask your question again. What's the order in verse 3?
And that's what I'm saying. In verse 3, Abel is first.
In verse 3, who's first?
Abel.
In verse 3,
Dalet Gimel? Or
yeah.
it says Abel became a shepherd and Cain became a tiller of the ground.
That's 2. That's base.
Ah, that's it. Ah, yeah, sorry. And then again, Cain is the one that brings first the speaks.
Yeah, so it switches back.
Yeah.
So it's going to be hard to make a clear deduction from that, right?
Yeah.
That's the reason why his is worse. It's AB, then BA, then AB. That's not going to help you decide why you should say that A brought lousy stuff. And it's an interesting thing to think about, but it's not going to help explain why he brought bad stuff. So we have two proposals on the table. There's at least one more that's relevant. Yeah.
Did it have to do with when the snake having told Eve and then Adam to eat from the tree, the fruit of the tree was higher, and after Adam and Eve ate from the tree, the snake was on the ground, and it was the food of the snake that Cain harvested, because the snake was slithered on the ground after.
I don't see what we're getting out of it. I mean, because no, but okay, the snake's food is dirt, and it's everywhere in the world, and that's why he hadn't have any worries about. That's the rabbinic understanding over there. That's not going to help too much here, and I should we'll leave that aside. Yeah.
Sorry, this might be like a simple reading of it, but could it just be that because technically like fruits that just fall from the tree, could technically be the first fruits? So could that be one of the interpretations? You just got fruits that was just on the ground, and then they just kind of like were bruised and it didn't exactly look that great.
Well, let me put it this way. We're on the borderline of a famous philosophical dispute. When you're trying to interpret what a text says, you could, I suppose, say, here's the rule of the game. I say it means X. Now, if nothing in the text contradicts me, nothing in the text says I'm wrong, it's fair for me to say the text says X. The other point of view would be, if you want to interpret a text, you need something in the text that tells you that your interpretation is right. It's not that there's an absence of something that says that it's wrong, but there's got to be something in it that leads to that requires it, needs that explanation. Macbeth. I say that meant Macbeth was trans. Was a trans man. I say it was trans. Where does it say in Shakespeare's book that it's not trans? You show me. Show me where it says Macbeth was not trans. Doesn't say it, right? So it's perfectly appropriate for me to interpret Macbeth as trans. Right? Maybe Macbeth is the name for a motel or for a ship. Maybe it's all about seafaring. Who knows? You can say whatever you want. The other person says, nothing in the text indicates, not in this text, nor in any other text, nor in any other book of the time, indicates the existence of such a category. To push it into the text is absolutely without foundation. So it's not enough that the fruit of the ground, well, some fruits fall onto the ground, so maybe here we could say that this is the first fruits that fell on the ground. There's absolutely nothing in the text that indicates that we're talking about fruits that fell on the ground at all, that maybe they're first or last. Nothing indicates that. So the only way you could suggest it is just to say, well, nothing contradicts it, so I'm offering it. But we have a much stricter standard for interpretation. There's something in the text that wants it, that pushes for it, right? But there is one other feature which I'm surprised nobody else has picked up. Should have picked it up from the way I read it. How far I read it. Yeah. What else?
I mean, first when we read the 3, Abel started to work first. I mean, Cain was born first, and then Abel, and then Abel started to work first, and then Cain. But then for the offering, Cain brought it first, and Abel second. But I mean, the key word seems to be bechorot. I mean, I see.
What?
Bechorot, like the.
Okay, that's what he said. Right? He said that the firstborn, right, makes them superior. Right.
That seems to be like also this service to Hashem, like somehow. Once Abel starts to work, why Cain follows? Like there seems to be like this kind of dispute in between them going.
You're putting in something which isn't obviously true, and in fact, if you read the verse 3, which I emphasized, and I changed the translation, you see it isn't correct. The fact that it says that Hevel went to work and Cain went to work doesn't mean he went to work first. Does not imply that. Does not imply that. Because in 3 it says, after a period of time, Cain brought an offering, and also Hevel he brought, it puts in the also to say that he followed Cain. He imitated Cain. He also brought. Without the also, I wouldn't say that. The text was to tell you that he was second and he imitated because it puts in the word also. And in verse 2 it doesn't put in the word also. Now, if two things happen, how are you going to say they happen together if they're two different things? Right, one on top of the other? So you don't have to read one and then the other, put one inside the other. I mean, so, George went to the store and Peter went to play baseball. It doesn't mean that George went first and Peter went later. It just means that that's what the two of them did. You have no choice. That's why the text in 3 wants to emphasize that Hevel followed Cain. It says he also. The Hevel, Gamhu, he also he. Not he also, because if you say he also, they wrote it could go with the verb rather than the subject. It's Gamhu in the Hebrew. Also he did. So it's definitely. But there's another feature here which is quite obvious. Yeah. No? Yeah.
It's that Hashem accepted Hevel and not Cain.
Yeah, what about that? Hashem accepted Hevel and not Cain, so that certainly implies that Hevel did something right and Cain did something wrong, right? That's for sure.
It's too obvious, that's why.
No, it's not too obvious, it's because it's wrong.
Oh, really?
Because Rashi says specifically that the quality was less. The quality was less. I'll give you another explanation of why he accepted Hevel's and not Cain's, because Cain's was stolen. How's that? That's a pretty good reason not to accept it, right? So the fact that he accepted one and not the other doesn't pin the problem on the quality of the produce. So that's not a good explanation. The word ha'adama has no implications here whatsoever. Pri ha'adama, we use that word to make our blessing on potatoes. So we would not be using a word that's degrading in any way to make a blessing to God for what we eat. By the way, I can't resist putting in a footnote here. When you have the animals going into the ark, you may have noticed this when it talks about different types of animals. So there are animals which are tahor, which we would say are capable to be eaten, and then the animals which aren't tahor, einenu tahor, not tahor. Well, later on in the Torah, when it talks about animals you can and cannot eat, the word is tahor and tameh. Tameh means defiled, polluted in some way. So some of the commentators ask, why is it, the Gemara says, you see how far the Torah went not to degrade something by not calling it tameh, but just saying that it's not Torah, but didn't say it was tameh. It used extra letters, made the text longer, but it went out of the way to say it in a way that wasn't degrading in that way. Yeah, but the rest of the Torah, it says 12 times tameh. So you have to explain why it was done here. She says the first time. Rabbeinu Yonah, Shari Tshuva, has an astonishing explanation. When you're talking about the animals going onto the ark, we're talking about animals which are going to be, among other things, food for the people who come off the ark, like the horses, like the camels, like the snails, like the snakes. They're going to eat them. There aren't Jews coming off the ark. The Torah's laws of kashrus haven't been given yet. Don't call somebody's food tameh. Don't do that. Don't call the food of the non-Jewish world tameh, because it's a degraded way to describe what they eat. Later on, when the Torah calls other animals tameh, it's describing the animals we don't eat. It's telling us not to eat them. That's okay. So look at the sensitivity here. You're describing for the non-Jewish world the food that they eat. Don't call it tameh. It's not nice. It's not appropriate to do that. Just say that it's not tohar, but don't say that it's tameh. So I'm saying that by background for the idea that the word ha'adama, meaning the land, is certainly not degraded, because if it were, we wouldn't be able to use it to make a blessing to God for the potatoes that we eat. So it's certainly not in the word. The answer that's given by the commentaries on Rashi is the implied comparison between the two of them, and that means that Rashi will register, calculate, and make use of an implied contrast. Not explicitly stated contrast, but an implied contrast. The person who taught this to me gave the following example. Someone comes to ask about students in the class. He says, what do you say about Peter? Peter, he always hands his homework on time, and he has intelligent things to say in class. He behaves well, and he takes his tests well. That's Peter. And what about John? John always comes on time. Did I imply anything negative about John?
No.
Oh, I think I did. Given that I said all of the praise about Peter, including all of his positive qualities, and I said, well, John doesn't come on time, I think I implied that John doesn't have those qualities, at the very least. Because otherwise, why would I mention it for the one and not for the other? So, that being the case, that's why Cain was not accepted. It was not accepted because it was of inferior quality, which is implied by the text, which shows you that Rashi cares not only about direct statements, but also about implications. Now that's very important because this text, one element of the style of this text is brevity. You know, the whole of the great story of the sacrifice of Isaac is told in like 25 sentences. 25 sentences, that's all. You know, and enormous amounts of information which you would like to have filled in, like what did he think and what did they feel and how did they discuss it, what were the options, how did they make the decision, all of that is left out. So that means that everything that's put in has to be read for maximum significance. Of course, you have to be careful not to push the significance in, but it has to be read for maximum significance. And that's what Rashi does all the way through. Yeah.
How do we know when it's conjecture or opposed to a natural and correct reading of inference?
So how do you know when it's conjecture versus a natural reading? So Rashi's stated methodology is to do it when it is let's see if I can find a better word than natural, a reading that the text needs. He stated his proposal to do it that way. Now, I'm not saying that Rashi is infallible, but there are more than 100 super commentaries on Rashi's commentary. And the theme that all of them start with is, what's bothering Rashi? What in the verse pushed him to say what he says? So that's something which is entirely in common. By the way, I must tell you, there was someone who taught here many years ago, Professor Victor Bonchek, who's a professor of psychology, and he wrote a work called "What's Bothering Rashi," and I have mentioned it in the past, and it definitely has merit. I just read a couple of days ago something which astonished me. Since he's a psychologist, someone rejected his book, denigrated his book, because he thought if a psychologist writes a book called What's Bothering Rashi, he thinks Rashi has psychological problems, and that's what drove him to write what he wrote. What's bothering him, you know? You're a psychologist, maybe he's got a psychosis or a neurosis somewhere in the line, you know, he's got a phobia somewhere in the line. The person said, that's terrible, what a terrible thing to say, what a terrible thing to do. Well, the person didn't pick up Professor Bonchik's book. His book is about how Rashi learned what he learned from the text. But I never dreamed of thinking what's bothering Rashi, what psychological problems does he have. But if anybody makes that false association, says, I read about someone who actually talked about it in that fashion and condemned it in that fashion without having opened it, obviously, which goes on a lot today. So you have to know, it's a valuable book, and it trains you to look for what in the verse needs help, needs some kind of treatment, which is what I told you at the very beginning. What I'm saying every time. What is it in the text that drives Rashi to say what he says? Yeah.
And what is the place for thematic readings of the text? Is there any place for that? Or
For what?
Thematic reading. Is that for people who have a much more holistic...
Thematic reading? No, I would say I would go even a step further. I would say any human sensitivity is fair game to start with anyway, and to say, the way I read a text, you know, it shouldn't have been this way. So, for example, if you have a text, let's say, that's all narrative, and in the middle of it there's a law, the commentators will talk about that. What's it doing here? Why would we put it in the middle of a narrative instead of in a legal section where we have all sections of laws which are
The
only...
Torah is split up into distinct sections that one can see.
So that's what I said about the spaces. The spaces on the right side, where the Hebrew is, are real gaps in the text. See, on this page you have no spaces. But,
Actually, yeah, in the previous
and there are two types of spaces. There's a space which goes all the way to the end, and there's a space which is surrounded on both sides by text. They're not equal. Now, in other editions of the Torah, you'll find Peis and Samach scattered throughout. Pei stands for Pasuach, meaning there is a space in the Hebrew text here which goes all the way to the end of the line. And Samach stands for Sagur, which means closed, which means there's a space here which is closed on both sides by text. Here, in this edition, they did it by actually leaving spaces, which I think was very, very well done. You see on the right-hand side immediately where the spaces really are. So those will definitely set things apart. And when you have, as I said, thematically, definitely. For example, you'll have a story that has several characters, and then it will break off to continue the story about one of the characters only, and then it will come back and pick up what happened to the other character. All of that has to be interpreted because you have to explain the continuity of the text. So all of that is definitely important. No question about it. Okay, I'll pick up tomorrow.